Hedgehogs are the most important creature on the planet. I think that's really quite well established by now. I've been studying them for nearly 30 years. I think what happens, most ecologists, they leave college, they go and start studying something, and then they move on to something else, and then they move on to something else, and they move on to something. I kind of just found hedgehogs and stuck with them. And that's partly because there is a bit of a niche there. There's a research niche. Lots of people have been studying the hormonal fluctuations of hibernating hedgehogs, but very little time is spent looking at what hedgehogs actually do. They've been largely ignored. They're not a pest species. They're not particularly exciting or demanding in any particular way. They were just ignored. And so I was up in Scotland, up in the Orkneys. I've been out to the Hebrides and been radio tracking hedgehogs around the place and just become more and more fond of them. But over time, it's become a case of realizing that they're the perfect vehicle to talk about wildlife, to talk about our relationship with nature. And so whilst I do have a very, very passionate love of hedgehogs, I use them as a tool to be able to get people to think about things perhaps that they wouldn't normally. A hedgehog has a very specific set of requirements, as do all species. And it's because people have a fondness for the hedgehog. They've been brought up with stories, with Mrs. Tiggywinkle stories. They've been brought up playing Sonic the Hedgehog. They've been brought up with all sorts of images of hedgehogs. I mean, it's very difficult to find a household object which hasn't been turned into a hedgehog. I have got a hedgehog cheese grater and plates and cups and tea towels and all these sorts of things. So they are iconic. In fact, the BBC Wildlife magazine just ran a poll of which is the most iconic species. The hedgehog won. So people therefore immediately get an idea about them. They're attracted to the hedgehog. And therefore I can start to use the hedgehog to talk about the fragmentation of the natural world. Now this is something which affects all species. This affects absolutely everything. But hedgehogs are particularly affected because most people measuring the biodiversity value of an area, they look at things that fly. They look at the birds, bats, and the insects, in particular moths and butterflies, because they're quite easy to monitor. Hedgehogs are difficult to monitor, and they are very, very heavily affected by chopping up of the landscape. So you can chop up the landscape by building HS2 through the countryside. That will split a whole chunk of the country. There'll be hedgehogs on one side, hedgehogs on the other side. We are now learning that possibly there are genetic differences will form quite quickly. But most importantly, we've been learning is that hedgehogs have got they need a large area to thrive. The minimum viable population for hedgehogs is around 32, absolute minimum, and they need 90 hectares within which to keep their population ticking over. That's 90 hectares of contiguous land. So you build your HS2 through the place, you're chopping pieces in half. You then, you get people building a housing estate and they put fences in people's gardens that chop the place up. Again, this is chopping them up into smaller and smaller pockets. So what I'm trying to do is get people to be excited about the idea of opening up their gardens, opening up everything. Take it wider, look at the way we manage our parks and see if people can start to open these up as well. So the hedgehogs have got an opportunity to have the 90 hectares they need to survive. I mean, the introduction of lions to the Peak District was probably an accident for the hedgehogs. The only natural predator that the hedgehog faces is the badger. And I wrote in my book of the horrifying scene of watching my little Willie being eaten by a badger. This was a lesson in particular in not naming your hedgehogs silly and cute, whimsical names. And there is a relationship now. If you plot the density of badgers of the UK and the density of hedgehogs, you'll find where you've got more badgers, you have fewer hedgehogs. However, it is a very big mistake to think that badgers are the cause of the decline in hedgehogs. We've got a 37% decline in hedgehogs in the last 10 years alone. That's absolutely rigorous scientific data on that one. And yes, there is a correlation between presence of badgers and absence of hedgehogs. But the declines in hedgehog numbers are happening fastest where there aren't badgers. And you have pockets of the countryside where badgers and hedgehogs are living together really quite well. So the relationship is complicated. I could go on at length about the asymmetric intra-guild predatory relationship if you wanted, but suffice to say, it's a complex relationship. It's not simply a causal relationship. The biggest problem that hedgehogs face is the loss of habitat, the loss of food, and the fragmentation of the remaining habitat. Those are the three key things. And you could probably say that about pretty much every single animal in the country, but I will stick with my hedgehogs. And you lose food when you intensify agriculture. So rural hedgehogs have a pretty rough time. You lose habitat when you develop. And you fragment the landscape that's remaining by the development and also by the intensification of agriculture. Hedgehogs aren't called that on a whim. They hog the hedges of things. If you don't have margins to fields, they're going to find a big field as much of an obstacle as the HS2 is going to be to them. So they need to be able to go around the edges of things. So those are the key issues that hedgehogs face, and we can begin to address those. There's a project which I'm working on called Hedgehog Street, please use any reliable search engine to go for Hedgehog Street, and you will find on there all sorts of top tips on how you can best improve your own locality for hedgehogs, and also ways that you can begin to communicate with your neighbourhood and take it wider.